My friends, today's story is about a truly remarkable speedrun record which you've never heard talked about here on YouTube before. A record so insane that, frankly, it defies what should have been possible in-game, and a record featuring a very familiar face, at least to viewers of this channel. Wave Race 64 is an iconic game for the Nintendo 64 that elicits tons of nostalgia for those who were fortunate to play it back in the day, especially when that intro screen music hits. Naturally, given that it is a racing game, it's seen many competitors take to its 8 courses over the years, looking to set time trial world records on a single lap or on all full 3 laps of the course. Most of these records today are held by just 2 gamers, Telfus and Shibby Pod, 2 great Wave Race 64 players in their own right. However, there is one record which neither of them have been able to touch since it was masterfully set in 2018, as this persists as the game's oldest 3-lap record. Indeed, today we're examining the truly remarkable score set by legendary speedrunner Illu, his 3-lap record on the iconic course, Drake Lake.
Here we go!
Let's look at the general history of most Wave Race 64 3-lap speedrun records in order to understand why the Drake Lake 3-lap record is indeed so truly remarkable. Just like most N64 racing games, Wave Race 64 is pretty well documented throughout the ages, and so we kind of see these trends emerge when looking at the overall history of the game. On most courses, we see something like this. A fella by the name of David Wan was one of the first to substantiate any record scores all the way back in 1997. Even though videos don't still exist of these runs, he's a well-trusted fellow and longtime member of the Mario Kart community, as well as maintaining and updating various websites documenting glitches and other early N64 content. Honestly, David Wan's substantial body of work is a deep dive well worth doing another time. But since Wave Race 64 didn't quite have its own website or rankings like GoldenEye or Mario Kart 64, we don't see very well substantiated records, generally speaking, until the mid-late 2000s through to about 2014, in which we see kind of random collections of players come in, set various records on the game's 8 courses. You know, some names are familiar, some aren't. And Eloo himself was one of these players who set a few of these records, along with many others. You know, we see Eloo show up in the world record history of Marine Fortress and of Twilight City, so that's pretty cool. This one's a funny story. You know, Eloo was hanging out with another European N64 gamer, Admiral Smit, for a weekend, in which time Eloo taught Smit the ways of Wave Race, to the point where Smit would achieve the world record on Sunset Bay 3-lap. And this was in the year 2009, so it kind of shows that even through this era of history, you know, the Wave Race records were still not all that well optimized, to the point where someone who could, you know, really be learning the game could get a record after only a few days of play. And this sort of early mid-history of Wave Race 64 time trial records has these sorts of stories. You know, somewhat randomly scattered entries of gamers, some well-known guys, and others getting records here and there progressing through time. Here's a picture I love that touches on Wave Race history from the legendary Virginia Lake House meetups of the late 2000s and early 2010s of the GoldenEye and Mario Kart 64 communities who would get together every year and, you know, have a gaming fest for a week. On the left we see Illu, and on the right we see David Wan, 2 guys who have made their marks in the history books of Wave Race 64. The fellow in the middle is just a guy known as Bill from Milwaukee, so hey, Bill, if you're out there, what a way to find yourself in the video. But 2014 is where Wave Race 64 history really changed, because this is where Shibby Pod enters the scene. Arguably the most influential Wave Race 64 time trials player of all time, and he certainly would leave his mark on the game. After some back and forth with other gamers, like trading records with Illu on Glacier Bay or GoldenEye legend Ryan Lockwood on Sunny Beach, Shibby Pod would, through 2014-15, obtain the world record on every course, and usually lower it numerous times, further optimizing the game. This is about the same era when speedrun.com was founded, and so this gave Wave Race 64 its first truly substantial set of leaderboards that could record the history and progress at a more archival level. And so we see many cases of Shibby lowering his scores over the next few years, very well documented and usually with videos to prove the whole thing. And in general, on most of these courses, Shibby would hold the records until another gamer, Telphus, came along and beat most of them, starting in about 2023-24, and Telphus's records last into present time. Now, one exception to this all is Southern Island, the game's final course. In this case, Shibby Pod took the record from Eloo in 2014, Shibby has lowered it like a dozen times, and Telphus has never been able to quite take the record on the course, having to settle for second place. So generally, Shibby Pod and Telphus have been the drivers of the progression of the game, lowering the records over the last 10 years. Now, a few of Shibby's records have also been improved by another runner, Azalea Akari, but these were indeed beaten by Telphus as well when he sort of took over the game. And that's the general theme of the history of Wave Race 64. 8 courses, and these are the 3 individuals who have pushed the boundaries of the game and lowered records over this time. But there is one great exception to this rule. One record that neither Shibby nor Telphus nor Azalea Akari have been able to touch since it was set in 2018. And that time is Eloo's insane 3-lap record on Drake Lake.
That's great! A new record!
So here's the story with Drake Lake and a bit of important knowledge about the course. Drake Lake is the 3rd course in Wave Race 64 and is particular for one very notable reason. Wave Race 64 is known for its incredible water physics, experienced on many courses by waves pulsing through the courses. This adds a bit of challenge when it comes to controlling your racer through the course, getting knocked off path here and there from the pulsating throws and inevitable power of Mother Nature, or at least her simulated version in-game. Now, most players will learn the wave cycles. Every course generally has a pretty set wave cycle that alters depending on which difficulty you're playing, normal, hard, or expert. And when it comes to time trials, the top players know the various wave patterns and cycles and will choose the difficulty that works best for a fast time on each course, which is usually, but not always, normal difficulty. But here's the thing, Drake Lake doesn't have any waves. When you load into the course, you're met with this pristine flat water lake, like many who have been fortunate enough to vacation at a cottage throughout the Canadian Shield, or Michigan, or Minnesota. And, you may have experienced such a beautiful, flat, misty lake on a serene morning, with the dawn's mist lightly clouding the perfect surface of the lake, and nothing but the ducks and drakes honking away peacefully. Hence the name of this course, Drake Lake. Now, not having waves doesn't inherently make the level easier, but it might make it a little more enjoyable to play, at least for some. Some people who kind of prefer these flat courses without very many waves, especially a guy like Eloo, an experienced speedrunner in many other Nintendo 64 games. Just like previously described, on the history of Drake Lake, we see a few early world records from some names familiar and unfamiliar to the deepest annals of Nintendo 64 lore. Then we see Shibby nab the record a couple of times in 2014-15 as expected. Now Eloo joins the fray and lowers Shibby's early record a couple of times, where it settled to 1 minute 11 seconds .212 in May 2016. And Eloo's record stood unmatched for a couple of years. But here's where something unexpected happened. In January 2018, a relatively random wave race player, Momo, burst into the scene with a new record on Drake Lake, 3-lap in 111.180, beating Illu's previous score by about 0.3 seconds. Now, fair enough, this is what happens every now and then. We've all had our records beaten or tied by some pretty random people. Momo has some decent times in Wave Race 64, a lot of top 10 and 20 times, and just sort of rose above the occasion to get this truly remarkable record on Drake Lake 3-lap. And speedrunning has many stories of these sorts of unexpected players showing up and getting a great world record. Well, I've certainly had random individuals tie my records, and it can be sometimes annoying or frustrating. And so in this case, Momo beating Illu's old record on Drake Lake caused Eloo to go absolutely beast mode. 4 days later, Eloo would reclaim his Drake Lake 3-lap record with 111.114, just finding it unacceptable not to hold the record on his favorite course. And over the course of the next few months, Eloo would lower this record even more times. Now, here's the funny thing with speedrunning, and especially as it pertains to barriers, when you look for a total time or a record you're going for. Sometimes you might have a time in mind, and it just might not be possible. I just made a video about how Illu went for this record in GoldenEye, Caverns Agent 1 minute. A really amazing record. But what if instead he was going for 59? Such a thing just might not be possible. Even though we tend to celebrate these huge barrier breaks, or someone clipping a minute or a second off of a well-known record. Super Mario 64 120 Star is a great example of this, where the last sort of great big barrier broken was the first 139, taking the score from 1 hour 40 minutes into that next sort of set of digits. Seeing the numbers change, after all, is kind of the core of speedrunning, as silly as it sounds. We play for hours and hours and hours, and you just want to see a number get trimmed down, whether it's a full point, 100th of a second, a full second is even cooler, a minute is even cooler, an hour is cooler. The men's marathon race is another great example where the length of the race is kind of random. It's based off of ancient Greek history and folklore. And it just so happens that it's almost the amount of distance that a human can run in 2 hours. The world record for the men's marathon is just over 2 hours long. And the 2-hour barrier is this massive, massive barrier in the marathon. Now, it has been broken in a sort of, set up exhibition setting, which is pretty cool, but it still hasn't been broken in real life. And is such a thing possible? It might just be that it's too much distance to cover. And likewise, in a speed run, maybe the level's just slightly too long, your speed isn't quite enough to break a barrier you have in mind. But Eloo found this unacceptable. He wanted to get Drake Lake something starting with 110. That was his ultimate goal. I've talked about Eloo at length in that previous video. Amazing GoldenEye career, amazing Super Mario 64 early record he set in 16 star. His Perfect Dark achievements are even incredible in their own right. He set a record in Defection Agent, which is still the record today from 2010, the longest standing record in the game's history, will probably never be broken. And he set complicated records too, like on very complex and advanced stages like Rescue Perfect Agent, that require these really insane strategies where you lure guards, do all sorts of insane stuff. And so Eloo is just a gamer, and he had his mind set on 110 something on Drake Lake. And my friends, on March 20th, 2018, with perfect driving around the course, zipping in and out of the beautiful barriers and just barely avoiding the wooden planks and piers sticking out of the water, Eloo clutched this run.
That's great! A new record!
There are some amazing comments on this video, original upload, Luke Sklar's former GoldenEye champion says better than Street's 110, a record that still hasn't been set yet in GoldenEye. Another comment says the pinnacle of human skill level. This is madness. You chipped away at it so many times. This was inevitable. But really, I think that sort of desire to push it below 111 into 110 is what makes this such an insane record. You know, it maybe shouldn't have been possible, kind of. But Eloo pushed the limits of the game every corner as perfectly as possible and grinded away for 2 months straight until he nabbed this time. And this is probably why Shibby Pod and Telphus have still not been able to achieve this record, because Illu just pushed it down that much deeper than any other record in Wave Race 64 has ever been pushed down before. Illu also has the record on the 1 lap on Drake Lake, and again, it's the only of the courses where Shibby Pod and Telphus don't have the world record. So Illu just has this total domination on Drake Lake, and it's just a sight to behold. Illu's comment description on his 110 is simply, I achieved my goal on the level of a sub 111 time, felt relief and joy after many hours of grinding for this. And it really is probably the greatest record ever set in Wave Race 64, one of Illu's defining achievements in this illustrious career as a Nintendo 64 speedrunner, and that's the remarkable story of the Drake Lake 3-lap world record. Thank you all for watching, my friends. Thanks for enjoying my videos. Thanks to the Patreon supporters and channel members for your extra support of my work. It's truly appreciated. Stay true, my friends, and I will see you in the next stream or video.